Now, why would 2nd Isaiah say this? Right? There are 2 or 3 different people's books that went into Isaiah. Isaiah was writing, the 2nd Isaiah, Deutero-Isaiah, was writing during the Babylonian exile when the Jewish community in Babylonia was coming into contact for the first time with these dualistic myths of a God of good and a God of evil. And so this later stage of Jewish development understands that no, there's only one God for everything. And this God creates the good stuff, our God creates the good stuff and creates the bad stuff. This now we see we are moving into a kind of universal monotheism, unlike the henotheism or monolatry that we discussed several lectures ago. So that verse is taken by the poet of the liturgy, and it is slightly adjusted to not emphasize the evilness, but to emphasize God's creation of the light. So the way that prayer service adopts the line is God forms light and creates darkness, makes peace and creates everything. They change the word evil to everything so that you don't have to dwell on the negative. But again, it's this idea that God is continually making light. It's not something that happened in the remote past. Now, in the Hebrew Bible, as well as in the liturgy, there are polemics against other religious systems. And we see this in the evening service as well. The evening service says that God arranges the stars in their heavenly rotations according to his will. Okay? So it's nighttime when you say the evening service. You see the stars, and God arranges them all according to the divine will. What is this a polemic against? Babylonian astrology. The Babylonians understood that the stars were gods and they controlled our fate. So the rabbis in the Talmud were willing to say, okay, maybe the stars do control your fate, but who controls the stars? God controls the stars. Right? You also see this in the opening chapter of Genesis, where you have light created on day 1, and the sun isn't created until day 4. Well, for the Babylonians, the sun was a god. But when the creation story gets reworked in its Jewish version or its Israelite version, the sun is just another one of God's creations, and indeed our God can create light even without a sun. So you see these subtle, or not so subtle at the time, polemics against other religious systems and religious ideologies. Okay, let's move into the central prayer that Jews say 3 times a day, in the morning service, the afternoon service, and the evening service. We're going to focus specifically on the daily Amidah, that daily central prayer, as opposed to the other Amidot, plural for Amidahs, the plural for Amidah, that are recited either on the Sabbath or on holidays. So the prayer begins, the Amidah begins by praising God. It's a good way to butter somebody up before you ask for a series of requests, and invoking the notion of the merit of our ancestors. Now, if you remember Tom Wolfe's book, Bonfire of the Vanities, he had something called a favor bank. So that if I do somebody a favor in 1980, I can wait even until the year 2000 to cash in my favor, and that person owes me one. Well, what the merit of our fathers does is to make that intergenerational. Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and in the modern movements of reform and conservative and reconstructionism, we say, and their wives, Sarah, Rebecca, Leah, and Rachel, they did such great things. They were such righteous people. God, you owe them one. Oh, but you know what? They're not around. So we're their descendants, so we'll be happy to take the payback ourselves. Right? It's an intergenerational favor bank. The second blessing in the Amidah it praises God's power and includes the power to resurrect the dead. Remember, that's something that distinguished the Pharisees from the Sadducees, and we'll have a session coming up on the world to come and resurrection of the dead, but it becomes a central component of Rabbinic Judaism, even though it's a late and marginal idea within the Hebrew Bible itself. The third blessing of the Amidah has Israel imitating the angelic choir and coronating God as king. Right? This is what we can do for God. We can coronate God because there is no king without a people. Right? You can't be a king of a kingdom if your kingdom has no population. So we're willing to recognize, we're happy to recognize, we sing in joy to recognize God as our king, and then we go into the petitionary requests. The middle section of the Daily Amidah contains the petitions, which some scholars understand to be a roadmap to redemption. The very first petitionary prayer begins with a request for the wisdom to know, the wisdom for knowledge. Right? It might be part of this intellectual elitism that promotes Talmud Torah over all other commandments, but more likely, it's a request to know God's will. Because changing our ways to reflect God's will then prompt God to forgive our past transgressions, and redemption will naturally ensue. And those indeed are the subsequent blessings. What redemption will then look like is outlined in the remaining blessings. Pain and suffering will cease, economic prosperity will prevail, and there will be an ingathering of the exiles to the land of Israel. Justice will flow like a mighty river, with punishment meted out to heretics and reward for the righteous. Jerusalem and the temple will be rebuilt, and finally, the icing on the cake is that the Messiah will come. The concluding blessings of this section serve as an exclamation point, asking God to hear our prayers. That's actually the concluding blessing of that middle petitionary section. It's important, and we'll come back to this idea, that all the work of this roadmap to redemption happens, all the work happens before we ask for the Messiah to come. Right? So the Messiah culminates the process of redemption rather than initiates the process of redemption. And that's very important to understand the psychology of rabbinic Judaism. Now, redemption involves Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel. So the role of the Messiah is relegated to the end of that process. All the work has been done prior to his appearance, and that reflects the rabbinic discomfort with messianic speculation, because the rabbis are creating the sequence of these blessings where? In Yavne, after the destruction of the Second Temple. And probably the final sequence doesn't happen until after the failed Bar Kokhba revolt. And so the rabbis were burned on messianic speculation, because every time they think that they're about to regain political sovereignty from Rome, it turns out very, very bad for them. So they retain the idea of the Messiah, but they relegate it to the distant future, to the very end of the process of redemption, to try to quash contemporary messianic speculation and not get into trouble in the future like they had in their very recent past. The final three blessings of all of the Amidahs serve as a conclusion, asking God to accept our prayer and thanking God for the miracles that are daily with us. That's actually my favorite blessing of the Amidah, because miracles are understood by the rabbis not only to be those supernatural occurrences of the parting of the Red Sea and the plagues and all the other lights and bells and whistles that we see in the Hebrew Bible, but the sun coming up and lightning and the formation of mountains, all of those things that are daily with us, they're also evidence of God's providential activity in this world, and they're considered by the rabbis to be miracles as well. The final blessing, of course, has to be beseeching God to bless us with peace. Peace is the ultimate hallmark of redemption. As we jump 1,500 years, there are certain modern reformulations of the traditional prayer that I want to mention here. The Reform movement that begins in the early 19th century, say by 1818, you have the beginnings of the Reform movement in Germany. They rejected the idea of the resurrection of the dead. And specifically in their 1885 Pittsburgh platform, when they got here to the United States, they said that the immortality of the soul, that's fine, we totally buy that. But they rejected the idea of a resurrection of the dead as not being Jewish in origin, and they really thought that it was not in keeping with modern sensibilities to talk about this kind of zombie action of folks being resurrected from the dead. So they changed that word dead in most of their prayers to God creates all life, the quickening of all life. So God enlivens everything, not just resurrecting the dead, not just giving life to the dead. Also, Reformed prayer books, in a way that is very much in keeping with the flow of the sequence of the blessings, they reject the idea of an individual Messiah. So no longer for the Reform movement is the Messiah going to be a male. That's not egalitarian, right? It's not gender inclusive. Nor will the Messiah necessarily be from the Davidic line. That's also about your pedigree rather than about your personal status. And so just like the blessings, the sequence of the blessings in the traditional prayer build up to a messianic era that the Messiah just caps off, well, what the Reform movement does is they cap off the Messiah, right, and bracket him. Once you've got the Messianic era, that's all the Reform movement is looking for. So they change, they're sensitive to the Hebrew, although there's far less Hebrew in classic Reform services than in traditional services, but they change the word redeemer to redemption, or they change the word in Hebrew, goel, to geulah, right? A subtle change, but it gets at a theological conviction. Reform and conservative prayer books have generally been uncomfortable with praying for the reestablishment of animal sacrifices. In the traditional prayer book, you pray to rebuild the temple and the fires of Israel. Well, those fires of Israel refer to the fires of the animal sacrifices. So even in the conservative movement, which is far more conservative with a small c than Reform or Reconstruction or the Reconstructionist movements, they've been uncomfortable, and so they've modified the language to talk about the animal sacrifices in the past, and that it's not necessarily going to be resurrected or it's not going to be continued in the future. So the temple may very well be rebuilt, but there'll be different ways of worshiping than had been the case in the past. Among the many reforms that the Reconstructionists have made, and in this case Reform and conservative Judaism as well, is to make the liturgy more gender inclusive, as I mentioned. So in general, when the patriarchs are mentioned, the matriarchs are also invoked. A further modification that Reconstructionist Judaism has made in its prayer book, Kol HaNeshama, is to not exclusively refer to God in the male gender. So very frequently, and it's somewhat unsettling for the traditional prayer that's not used to this kind of language, but it doesn't take you so long to get used to either. God is referred to as the source of all being or as the womb of all life, and then the pronoun, because Hebrew requires gendered pronouns. Hebrew doesn't have the neutered pronoun it the way English does. So God is referred to in the feminine. And again, that's something that is very modern, very new, and has not crossed the denominational lines into mainstream Reform or mainstream conservative Judaism. I want to finish the lecture with a quote from the Talmud that gets at perhaps a justification for liturgical modification. A prayer that doesn't innovate is not a prayer of supplication. Now, the rabbis and the halakha, Jewish law, they have problems with changing the fixed text of the blessings. But we also see a voice that says, look, if there's no innovation, if it doesn't mean something new or say something new, then it's not a genuine prayer of supplication. And so perhaps this is the motivation for contemporary denominations within Judaism to experiment with new forms of the liturgy. Okay, so we will next examine the third leg of Shimon the Righteous's tripod of what the world stands on, deeds of loving kindness.